Hello, I'm Molly Phillips, Executive Director and General Manager at Iowa PBS. Welcome to the advance online premiere of Accessibility Now, our newest documentary that explores the Americans with Disabilities Act from the perspective of Iowans with disabilities. After the 30-minute program, we will continue the conversation with a panel discussion including the individuals featured in the film. Please share any questions you have in the comments. Thank you again for joining us. Enjoy the program.
The following program is presented as part of Move to Include, a public media initiative made possible with support from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
Permeated every area of my life, and without the protections and the rights it affords me as a person with a disability, my life would look very, very different. I likely wouldn't have a college education, I likely wouldn't have a job. And I also wouldn't be protected from institutionalization later in life, which is a threat that a lot of people with significant disabilities have to live with, and fortunately have, through the ADA, an avenue to protect their right to live and work in the community.
Let me paint a picture for you. I'm often asked what life was like before ADA for a person with a disability. Think about it this way. Life was one of segregation, separation from your family, like my brother, from your friends, from your community. It was a life where of severe limitations of where you could go, what you could do, what you could be. It was a life of hurtful language. Think about the language that was used. But it was also a life where the most well-meaning people treated you with pity and patronizing attitudes.
Well, my name is Kenzie Shannon. I am from Des Moines. My entire family has pretty much been raised on the east side of Des Moines. So pretty much my whole family is a native Iowan. We're very integrated into the community. And as I was raised here, we realized that I also actually ended up having a deaf brother, so that I wasn't the only deaf person in my family. And so I was able to have somebody I was living with who was deaf as well. And so as I went through my school system and grew up and eventually went to college and built relationships with more deaf people, and knowing the hearing world and my background coming from that, but also having a deaf brother, and then transitioning out into the deaf world and within that education system really expanded my identity, and that's how I kind of grew up. And so we have the two Shannons in the family who identified as deaf.
It's called osteogenesis imperfecta, more commonly known as brittle bones disease. So I've broken maybe 50 odd bones in my life and have a lot of different ongoing issues related to that. So I grew up with a significant disability, and I benefited tremendously from a lot of really important legal protections that made my life possible.
My hearing loss, it's the Usher syndrome type 2, which typically born with a hearing loss and vision loss later in life, usually teenagers. Mine wasn't discovered until 2012 for the vision loss. There is a spectrum of deaf blindness because I fall into that spectrum of having low vision and hearing loss, enough to where I have to wear hearing aids to hear and understand a normal conversation. And then you can go to the other end of the spectrum of just like Helen Keller herself, who is completely blind, completely deaf. You can have any combination in between, to where you have somebody who's deaf, completely deaf, but has low vision like myself. So their primary language would be American Sign Language. But then you can have somebody who's completely blind and hard of hearing, and they voice. And you can have somebody that's in between, where they're hard of hearing, you have to talk really loud, and they have, just very little vision left. So they need a lot of assistance with mobility, either using a cane or a guide dog.
The Americans Disabilities Act, as we're to understand, is one of the most comprehensive civil rights legislation ever written. And it really aimed to open up areas of American life that people with disabilities hadn't been able to really interact with at all. We've been very marginalized to the periphery of American life. And the entire aim of the ADA was to open that up. An entire generation of people with disabilities have finally now been able to grow up with those protections in place. And the ADA generation is about growing up with the understanding that you're going to have the legal right to receive government services in an accessible way. You're going to have the legal right to succeed or fail in your job by your own merits and not by a whole bunch of preconceived notions of disability. And so it's an incredible privilege to grow up with those protections, knowing that so many people fought so long and hard for those things to be put into place. But it's also a stewardship. It's a responsibility. I think people think of laws as if they're passed, we put them in a dustbin somewhere, and we pull them out when we need them, right? But laws are very much living things. They change, they grow. The expanse of what is an ADA issue and what isn't has changed over time. Courts and legal minds have had to kind of fight and struggle and talk and understand what does the ADA mean in the 21st century.
So we are coming up on the 30th anniversary of the passage of the American Disabilities Act. How has it impacted your life?
So the Americans with Disabilities Act, I remember my family talking to me and saying these are the things you have to be aware of, and I remember thinking I'm gonna have to work so hard, but then being so thankful for a law that people have to follow to provide services. And it was my privilege to go through the education system with interpreters, because I was mainstreamed. And so I was the only person in that deaf school. So it was nice to have that access. And then I went to college, and I was mainstreamed with deaf and hard of hearing people. And I remember having one deaf teacher who I could actually directly communicate with, and it was so great to have that. And so when I continued on that path and had some hearing teachers with interpreters, also with note takers, with other students there within that hearing classroom, within these advanced college classes with these deep discussions, and I'm trying to keep track of hearing students making comments also through the interpreter, also with the hearing teacher. I ended up being able to go to the disabilities office and having contact with them so they could make sure that my accommodations were being met. And so I did that. I followed up with the disabilities office, and I just let them know, like, these are the rules that are supposed to be set up, and they followed that and were able to provide accommodations.
For me, that's where it started, was my hearing loss wasn't discovered till I was 5 years old. I had started school. And it was a teacher that said, there's something wrong here, that I'm either not listening or I'm not hearing. So she went to the principal of the school, and then they brought in my parents, and then they had a meeting, and they decided what the next step was to do, and that's how they discovered my hearing loss. So from that point on, the educational system made sure that I had whatever accommodations I needed to be mainstreamed. And so I was raised in the hearing world, but I had accommodations along the way for my hearing loss, and even through college. When I moved here to the States, still with the ADA laws, it's very important because it's still important with the education. I went back to school here, and I felt like I was still in Canada in the sense that they have a disability advisor at the colleges and universities, so that we do have those accommodations to study and to learn so that we can, in the end, find a job. So that's where the ADA is important, because if it wasn't before that, I wouldn't have had an education at all.
Still today, people have patronizing attitudes. I know what's best for you, which, of course, started the national cry of the disabled community: nothing about us without us. Now, don't tell us what we need and what we should do. Ask us. We'll tell you.
It's easier to probably tell you ways it has an impact in my life. My ability to get on a bus and go down to the mall to have an evening with my friends, or my ability to go to Drake University as a student, to live and operate independently. My first job, I had to talk about accommodations and how I could, maybe move the taking tub from, way up high to down low so I could work at the movie theater and rip tickets. And I think a lot of times people with disabilities, the idea that we live and work independently with help, with supports, but still a life of our own making. And that's what the ADA has allowed me to do. And it's important to remember that the ADA is only as strong as people willing to enforce it. And I don't take those protections for granted, because without all of us pushing together to reaffirm these rights, they're not going to get used. And they're not going to get used to pressure and to pull us along into adopting a more equitable treatment of marginalized people.
So for myself as a deaf individual, the ADA obviously applies to my life, but I would want to make sure that people know their rights and that they know the law and that they know that it applies to them, thinking I'm supposed to receive these accommodations same as a hearing person, whether I'm disabled or not. But if you're disabled, you are able to have those accommodations. And the purpose for the ADA is, I think the way that it can be improved for the ADA as a law is to be able to ask the person who is disabled, what do you need, rather than following maybe somebody else's accommodations, or these are the standards that have been set up, or this is just our process that's been grandfathered in, or this is our philosophy. Instead, we should be focusing on the people, focusing on the law and what they need, and developing maybe more with disabilities, because I think there's a lot of invisible disabilities that can come into play as well. And so people need to also be able to advocate for themselves, but recognize that there are disabilities. And I think that people with disabilities might struggle with being able to advocate for that. So being able to talk about their rights, or going to disabilities offices, or getting, civil lawyers involved if needed when they're having those frustrations.
Well, sometimes in general public, it's like, well, you don't look blind. I think that's a common thing. You don't look deafblind. I've run into many people not realizing that I have hearing aids. And I'd have to attribute that to my speech therapist. I had a very good one. And I had him from grade 4 to grade 12. And I mean, even in a general conversation with him, he would correct me. And I would argue with him as any teen would. Well, nobody else says it that way. You just don't hear it. So he wouldn't let any excuses. So that misconception that, I do wear 2 hearing aids, you can't always see them.
It's reaffirming that I, as an American citizen, have value, and I, as a person, have value, and that because people with disabilities are valuable, because we have something to offer, our society loses something when it forces us to the back of the line, or it forces us into the corners of our own society. That we are all made better by diversity and inclusion, and that not only are we going to make this big value statement, we're actually going to provide the legal protections and the means of which to make it a reality. And that's what the ADA is. It's a tool to use to help break down those barriers, many of which that have existed for, generations after generation. I work at Disability Rights Iowa, which is a law firm for people with disabilities, providing legal and advocacy services for people. I'm not an attorney, but I'm an advocate who kind of helps people navigate different accessibility barriers or things that might be preventing them from being able to go to work.
I currently work with Helen Keller National Center for the Deafblind. This job that I do is the position is titled Deafblind Specialist. And its main focus and goal is employment for our deafblind consumers. So being able to show them that, yes, we can do what we want to do, as same as anybody else. But I also learn from them. And that's what makes it good for me, is I can learn from them, from their experiences, because some of them are older than me. And they know more. They've had it rougher than me. They didn't have all the accommodations. So that relationship is important to me. And I can remember in 6th grade learning about Helen Keller herself, her story. And then, I always wanted to do something like what she did.
Communication, just making sure that people have like a relay number, meaning if they are using a video phone or they're on their phone because they want to go out and do something, how are they able to call another person or call for help if they're stuck somewhere? What do? I make sure that people have a video phone app. Maybe they're using Sorensen, Convo, ZVRS, like those companies provide free relay services for deaf and hard of hearing people to have to download on their phone. But they can also have it at home as well, which is what I use for my work environment. And so I really try and encourage people to have those, to be able to use them to connect. So I provide those supports. Or if they need to make a doctor's appointment, I make sure they're able to make those phone calls. And also for people to know they have a right for their employer to meet their needs, to meet their communication needs, to make sure that their general rights just as a human being with the ADA law, with the disability services advocate is there for them.
The unemployment rate for adults with disabilities today is the same as it was 30 years ago. That is a blot on our national character. When we have shown, we know, not only we, the business community, people know when they hire a person with a disability, they'll get the best worker they've ever had. Someone who's loyal, someone who works hard, someone who always shows up to work on time, makes fewer mistakes. Believe me, we have so many studies of this. That's the one thing, since my retirement from the Senate, the one thing I'm focused on is employment of persons with disabilities in what we call competitive integrated employment. That means not some job set aside for a person with a disability. That means hiring a person with a disability for a job for which that person is qualified, working alongside everybody else. Same pay, same benefits, everything.
I think overall, as for ADA, we got to keep moving it forward and keeping adding to the ADA laws of accommodations, different accommodations, as technology changes. Technology is always changing and always adding an extra avenue or independence for individuals, whether we're deaf-blind or whether there's mobility issues of a physical, mental. The list goes on and on as far as what technology can do nowadays compared to even 20 years ago. The technology, I have watched it grow in the last 20 years. There's always new apps, there's always new programs coming out. So the ADA law needs to continue moving forward and adding whatever accommodations are needed. And if something new comes up for an individual saying, hey, I can do that, but they're not allowing me, they need to speak up and say, I can do it.
Well, the ADA law that I feel like has been set up, I think we really want to continue to update that, and with social media being on top of that, and TV and closed captions, all these things being added, are these things covered? Are interpreters always covered? With COVID-19 that happened, it's a nationwide pandemic. We saw a lot of interpreters on TV, but were they always there? Or did they have captions? It really varied. Sometimes there were none. And so the access provided by the ADA is the most important, and we really need to be following that. So in the future, I'd like the ADA to make sure that people are aware that they can get their communication needs met, and making sure they're reasonable accommodations that are met. And because I don't want people to face these frustrations with their disability. So we have that law so that they can advocate for themselves. And the ADA also needs to advocate for people and make sure that the people who have been passing the law continue to enforce that law.
We need to fulfill the promise of the ADA, which was the idea that we are not going to take a natural expression of the human experience and take disabled people and segregate them off in the periphery of American life. That is not acceptable. And that's, George H.W. Bush was very clear that the entire aim of the ADA was to take down those barriers, right? The shameful walls of exclusion, I believe is what he called it. And that promise is not being fulfilled when we are forcing people with disabilities into a situation where they have to either live in the facility and to receive even the basic elements of care. To live kind of with that sort of Damocles over our head, right? That real risk of institutionalization is not a good way to live your life. So the ADA now, by being interpreted by the courts, is a means to protect people from institutionalization. And that process and kind of that whole transformation out of that decision is ongoing. And unfortunately, we're living in a situation now where institutionalizations have become incredibly dangerous for people with disabilities. And I really worry of all the thousands upon thousands of people with disabilities who are living in institutions, not because that's how they want to arrange their life, but for lack of fulfilling the promises of the Americans Disabilities Act. So I'm trying to remain thankful for all that I've lived, all these protections that I've enjoyed and have helped shape my life. Well, I'm also cognizant of the fact that our failure to fully live up to the ADA has left a lot of people behind. And not everybody's going to be here by the time we get to where we want the ADA to be.
I grew up always learning, you can do what everybody else does. There's nothing to stop me. There's nothing really to stop us from doing what we want to do. And the same as everyone else.
The program you just watched was presented as part of Move to Include, a public media initiative made possible with support from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for the online premiere. and VIP watch party of Accessibility Now. My name is Caroline Clark, and I'm the engagement manager at Iowa PBS. I apologize greatly for the technical issues we had a little earlier, but I'm glad you all were able to enjoy and watch the program with us. So to continue the conversation, we're joined here tonight by the individuals featured in the program: Lori McBride, Emmanuel Smith, and Kenzie Shannon. Joseph Jones is also joining us. He's the executive director of the Harkin Institute for Public Policy and Citizen Engagement, and he'll be moderating our conversation. And Hayes Interpreting Services is here with us as well to provide ASL interpretation. Joseph, do you want to get us started with the first question?
Great. Thank you, Caroline. And thank you for joining us as we commemorate and reflect on the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. To our audience, please feel free to send us questions as we discuss with our guests for the next half hour or so. And thank you again to Emmanuel, Kenzie, and Lori for sharing your stories in this program and also spending time with us here a little bit afterward. So everyone just finished watching. Some watched some parts of it twice. What do you hope that others learn from watching this program? We'll start with Kenzie.
What I'm hoping that people were able to see from this documentary is to see that there is an importance with accessibility and having the ADA and just recognizing our needs and also recognizing our accessibility path through getting what our needs are. So I think it's very important and very critical to get those and just for people to be aware of the need to advocate for ourselves.
Emmanuel?
Yeah, I think a lot of people may have heard of the Americans Disabilities Act, but they may not have understood that it's one of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation ever passed. And it really is the bedrock of disability rights and so many of the legal protections that people with disabilities look to allow us to live in the community and have those fully integrated lives. And so I hope that we all continue to look to ways that we can build on that legacy and really make the ADA a fulfilled promise.
Mm-hmm. And Lori, what about you?
For myself, I mean, in this film, I hope that people see that just because we have a disability doesn't mean we can't do the job. Just like what Tom Harkin is striving for is a regular job. And having that ADA law to support us in that, I think, is key, that people understand that and learn that, that we do have a means to our job and to our dream job.
Yeah, and he talks about competitive integrative employment and how important that is to him. And I know it is to the three of you as well. Emmanuel, you specifically mentioned the ADA generation of which you are a part and talked about the responsibility of being a steward of the ADA. Tell me a little bit more about that and why it's important to you.
Well, I grew up here in Iowa, and my mom took me to the Iowa State Capitol to watch Senator Harkin speak, and I think it was the 10th anniversary of the ADA, and being kind of surrounded by my community, it helped me to understand that so many people had worked to fight for my right to go to school, to have a job, to be treated with dignity and respect. And it would be a real disrespect to their legacy and their work to not push things forward and most importantly, protect and make real the protections of the ADA.
Sure.
It's very easy to take those protections for granted. And as I was mentioned in the documentary, those laws and those regulations are only as real as we make them. And that means we need to hold each other to account and really hold our institutions to task when they're failing to meet their obligations.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. I think that I'd be remiss that if I didn't ask you a question about higher ed, since the Harkin Institute is at Drake University, and I know you've all had some great and interesting experiences in your educational careers, specifically in higher ed. And Lori, I think you went to school and then you came back and went to school again later on for a different degree, and so you've had this span of time in higher ed. So we'll start with you and tell us a little bit about your experience.
Well, for myself, the first time I went to college was in Canada. And at that time, I didn't have a vision loss, but I had a hearing loss. And with the support of my speech therapist and the college, we had an FM system set up, and I had a note taker set up in my classes. There was only one teacher that there's a couple teachers that didn't want to wear the FM system, the microphone.
Mm-hmm.
They thought they'd feel uncomfortable. And I let it go the first class, but then the next day I had a different teacher, but in the same room. And it sounded like a gymnasium. And he said the exact same thing. And I was floored. And I I basically told him, my right is to be in this class because I'm paying for it. You need to wear it or you need to go, was basically how I put it. And he wore it. He liked his job. So he wore it and he completely forgot about it. And the next day I had a different teacher and I had zero problems. Now I went back to college in 2015 here in the States. And that's about 10, 15 year span. The teachers now are like, okay, what do you need from me? I think that generation of teachers have learned that, that there is needs out there for us students with disabilities, and there's so different disabilities. There's learning disabilities, there's all sorts. So the teachers now seem to be more open to access and accessibility. So that I noticed was a big difference, because now I had to accommodate for my vision loss. That I didn't know what to do. I actually had to ask, what is out there? Because I was learning. So
and they were helpful to guide you through?
Yeah, and it got me through, and I graduated from college and university with honors. So they did something right.
No, that's great. Kenzie, what about your higher ed experience?
So I actually earned my master's degree and I went to a deaf university. It's the only deaf university in the entire world, which is very cool. Right. I had my language, my community, my culture there. Previous to that, I did earn my bachelor's degree in criminal justice. And that experience with my internship, being within the hearing world, showed me how to face the real world, and then to move on to get my master's degree in social work. That's where I was able to see like my higher ed experience from the past can guide me through that journey to make me have a successful life. So I was able to approach my obstacles and overcome them throughout my life.
Thank you. And Emmanuel?
Yeah, as you had mentioned, I was lucky to go to Drake, and I absolutely loved my time there. The professors were incredibly accommodating and helpful, and I had access to disability services and a lot of really important supports that allowed me to really enjoy my time there. But for anybody who's been on a college campus, or Drake specifically, the logistics of campuses can be really difficult. And a lot of the buildings are pretty old and not really equipped to support people with disabilities. And so, I'd go to places like the student library, and the kind of lift they have the wheelchairs in there, I think was probably built when the Soviet Union was still around. So I'm hoping that college institutions are, as people with disabilities going to school and achieving higher education becomes more and more normalized, and we remove those barriers that so many young people with disabilities face when they're looking to go to college.
Mm-hmm.
Those institutions of learning will really update a lot of these buildings and make them more accessible and open, because I really worry about all the talent that we lose when we don't open those places up and really make use of all the incredible people that make up each generation of people with disabilities.
Sure. I'm fairly certain that each of you gets asked this question quite a bit, so I'm going to give you all a chance to put it out there for everyone. What experience or accomplishment have you appreciated the most because of the ADA? Lori?
I think for myself, would be my family, is because I don't know how to explain that one, but the education piece is high there, because without that educational piece, I actually wouldn't have been able to move to the States. So that links to my family, because my family is here as well as in Canada. So with the education, I could have my job and been able to work here in the States for the past 20 years. So those are the three things: my family, my education, and my job.
Great. And Kenzie, what about you?
Being able to see my privilege of getting to see the guidance and like the modeling that I've had growing up, and what was taught to me, what I can do and what I'm capable of. So that helped me to be successful, and I could take those steps forward. And then I could look at where I've gotten to today, where I'm able to stand today. So I want to be able to give that back to the deaf community, especially to my family and their support, their ability to help me transition into a successful life by providing resources and getting access all throughout the community, as well as having the legal system set up, the ADA set up.
Great. Emmanuel?
I think a lot of people with disabilities agree that we often get bombarded with a lot of negativity and a lot of messaging that we're not welcome in society as a whole. And you really can't overstate the importance for a young person with a disability. It's really important to me to hear a president of the United States talk about those barriers and how they need to be dismantled, and that my presence as an American citizen is valued. Incredibly powerful thing. Now, obviously, the logistical barriers that the ADA has removed from me has, entered every area of my life. But just as a question of human dignity, that core philosophy behind the ADA has been an incredible comfort, and I think helped the disability pride movement really come into its own over these last 20 years.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. Kenzie, you mentioned a lot the concept of community. You talked about it in the documentary. You've talked about it a couple of times now. And for those folks who are watching and listening to our panel, would you talk a little bit about the deaf community and what we mean by that when we say deaf community?
Of course. So what the deaf community means is that we have a group of deaf people who all have varying identities. They could be deaf-blind, hard of hearing, they could be late deafened. There's so many different things, but the language is the same, the culture is the same. So for example, in the state of Iowa, we have 7 different deaf clubs just within our region. And those could be like local, where you live, maybe where you were raised, maybe what the background you're in or the city you're currently living in, or you could be in an urban city or a rural community. So if you're just thinking like locally within the state, and then within the state, and then within the nation, there's so many different deaf communities out there. And so like where I was born into a hearing world, but I was able to find my deaf community by finding people who were similar to me, having the same backgrounds, having the same disabilities, knowing that they are deaf as well, and that I'm not the only one. And I was able to grow and find my support system through that.
That's great. That's absolutely wonderful. So I'm going to preface this by saying that I love my job, but I am really, really envious of the work that all 3 of you do. You all have Really fascinating work, and I know that you all love the work that you do. So tell me about the work that you do now and why it's so important to you, Emmanuel.
Yeah, as was mentioned in the documentary briefly, I'm an advocate at Disability Rights Iowa, which is a part of a network of law firms and legal clinics for people with disabilities to protect their rights and make sure they're being treated with dignity. And my job in particular deals a lot with barriers to employment. And people with disabilities really struggle with transition. They can often struggle to get the essential services they need in order to work and really pursue a career. And it's incredibly fulfilling to help in whatever way I can for somebody to navigate that process and find a degree of security and, you know, the really the self-assuredness that can come with work.
Mm.
I'm really thankful for the opportunity, and it doesn't hurt as a person with disability to have a few attorneys on speed dial in case I run into any ADA issues of my own.
No, that's fair. Lori, what about you?
And for myself as a deafblind specialist, the main focus is employment and finding, helping the deafblind consumer find the job that they want within their community. But then it's also to be an advocate for them with the employer. And at the same time, what I really enjoy about it is I get to learn about all these jobs.
Mm-hmm.
I don't actually have to do them. It's kind of like Dirty Jobs show.
Small snippet.
But it's making sure that the consumers, when they go to a job interview, that they have the accommodations. If they need an interpreter or if they need transportation, that they have what they need. And that the communication is understood between the employer or potential employer and the consumer. So making sure all of the ducks are in a row,
Mm-hmm.
successful for both the employer and the consumer is what I love about it. Making that connection and that it works and that they're both happy, both satisfied with everything. But learning about new jobs is one thing I'm looking forward to all the time.
And Kenzie, I think we got to see you doing a little bit of work in the documentary. So tell us about your work.
So my job is that I serve only deaf and hard of hearing students and adults who are looking for jobs. They're looking for skills and gaining experience so that they will be prepared for employment. And just focusing on the transition as well, making sure that the students can build up their skills or any gaps that they've been missing growing up so that they can be successful within their future. My job, the communication, is actually key because the deaf within the disability label or within the disability group, it can impair some communication because it's obviously connected with language. It's American Sign Language, so I'm making sure they communicate through an interpreter or through the various ways that are needed. So my job is to accommodate a variety of people, whether they're deaf, hard of hearing, deaf, blind. So I've worked with Lori because I'll refer some job clients to her because she works with deaf blind community. So just making sure I'm using my resources through my job.
Sure.
And a lot of different kind of people who are out there looking for a job, and so my goal or my work is to get them from when I used the VR counselor in high school myself, that person provided support and they were a deaf counselor as well. And so I was able to get those services through him. And so now I see myself in that role as a VR counselor or a voc rehab counselor. So I want to give back to the deaf community and make sure that they're successful throughout their life.
And I'm glad you're doing it. Emmanuel, you talked in the documentary about value, talked about feeling valued, but also the idea that businesses or employers could see some value in diversifying their workforce by having people with disabilities there. Talk to me about this concept of value for you and why that's important and why you preach that, if you will.
Yeah, when I was getting up to go to Disability Rights Iowa every morning at my old apartment building, there was a lot of elderly folks who lived in that particular building. And as I was leaving one day, I heard one of them say, wow, he really volunteers at that disability rights place a lot. And I kind of encounter that a lot. There's a certain amount of surprise that comes with people with disabilities working and having jobs, and really that's not assumed in the same way that it is for anybody else.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping that the ADA, as it continues to grow and be implemented, we can normalize that much more and really make a situation where people with disabilities live under the same expectations that we all live under. The idea that we'll have families and work and spend our money irresponsibly and do all the kind of things that everybody else does. So I'm trying to do my part to help that process along. And that's going to require a lot of work to take away those kind of rocks in the road that people with disabilities encounter constantly when trying to work and getting trapped in these cycles of poverty that we really created with so many of our national policies.
Sure. Kenzie, you talked a little bit about access to communications and the importance of it. And obviously, we're all living through a pandemic right now. All of us are in different locations as we have this conversation. And for people in the deaf community in particular, tell us about that access for communications, particularly in terms of getting up-to-date critical information, and how you see a role for society to make some changes to make it better.
So communication is very important to get it all out to the public, especially with COVID-19, because it's happening to everyone. So making sure people are aware and are up to date about what's going on. For myself as a deaf person, do I use the masks? Am I wearing them when I'm going in different areas to make sure I'm safe? And then if that, again, then when I'm trying to communicate, am I able to understand that? Or does that become a barrier? Do I have to ask for some different masks so that I can maybe see somebody's mouth? Or do I have to ask for a paper to write on? Or do I need to use a face shield instead so I can see their whole face? Because sometimes we need to be able to see the person's mouth and to be able to read their lips a little bit more. So we need to ask for maybe some different accommodations that are out there, or making sure we ask for patience, or maybe speaking with our boss and trying to communicate that way. So it's really important to have that. So I always have paper and pen ready so that I can write if need be to be able to communicate between people. And then with social distancing as well, it's hard to write because you have to stay 6 feet apart. But then it's hard to communicate because I'm using sign language and they might not be. But sometimes I'll use an app called Big, and I'll type on my phone and it can write it very largely, and then I can use my phone as another way of communicating to show people what I'm trying to say. But those are some obstacles that we can encounter, so we have to learn through those and as we go, and that's just how we do it.
Thanks for sharing that. For all of you, what's the biggest barrier in your life that could be overcome with some sort of modification to the ADA or a greater sense of focus on accommodations? Lori?
Right off the top of my head, I don't know of any other than with the COVID. I mean, there's always room to maneuver in there, but the difficult part is we don't know what's safe and what's not because it's so new.
Yeah. Emmanuel?
Yeah, I'm lucky enough to have an incredible support network. But I think for anyone, I really would like to see the ADA implemented more in regards to community-based services and providing that kind of safety net to ensure that people who don't want to live in facilities, don't need to live in facilities, can live in community and maintain that in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be a huge relief to me to know that those supports were more robust and respected, and so that I never would have to worry about either having to rely heavily on that support network or ultimately living in a facility. And so that's kind of a specter that a lot of people with disabilities live under. And I know we would be really happy to have that shadow kind of taken away.
Sure. Kenzie, what do you think, the barriers?
What I would like to add on there is with COVID-19 and the accessibility, I feel like it's become more limited. So there's less physical things going on, so we're more virtual or viral. We might be using a phone rather than in person. So if we have a deaf or hard of hearing person within the community, they need to be able to have those tools adapted for that. For example, having an interpreter. Is it an in-person interpreter, or are they using video relay services? Or they could be using video remote interpreting, which means that is ready at any time. So it's able to go at any moment. So those are 3 different kinds of services that can be provided. So that's something I would like to get that is added on to the deaf and hard of hearing accessibilities or accommodations that are needed for us to just have access to make sure that we are updated with what is going on. So I just think it's really important to continue to follow the ADA law and make sure that that law is updated itself. And like with COVID-19, making sure that we have the resources on that so that we're all up to date.
Sure. So we are all commemorating and celebrating 30 years of the ADA. And as we look forward to 2050, say another 30 years, what remaining accessibility issues do you wish we as a society would have tackled by then? Manuel?
Piggybacking somewhat on my previous comment.
Yeah.
I'm glad we're celebrating today, and I'm really happy we owe that to ourselves. We owe that to all the people who worked hard to make the ADA a reality. But it's somewhat of a bittersweet anniversary this time around, especially because so many states have refused to fully implement the ADA, Iowa included in some ways. And that's led to thousands upon thousands of people with disabilities being put into institutions to suffer a great deal, and led to a lot of loss of life that could absolutely have lived fully in the community and fought so long to do so. And I think it would be wrong of us to not recognize that and take a moment to realize that there are a lot of people that are not here with us today and not here to celebrate these anniversaries because of the violence of neglect, which, because it's passive, we don't, I think, often recognize it as such. And that can only stop when we really demand that these states come into compliance with the Americans Disabilities Act, provide these community services, and those who fought so hard against them being implemented are really held to account and look at the human cost of those actions.
Thank you for sharing that. Lori?
I think one of the key things to keep moving forward too with ADA is the access. One thing that came to mind is some of the news that we watch on TV. Some news channels are closed captioned, some are not. And if they're not closed captioned, even though I hear, I'm not going to watch it anymore because I'm so used to reading the closed caption. So I think getting more consistent, I mean, it has been getting consistent with closed captions on everything, but live TV is difficult. And I get that because you're trying to keep up with the person talking. You don't know what the transcript is. But even our local news, I've seen where the weatherman talks about something other than weather on the show, and there's no caption. And it's like, well, what is he talking about? So getting that access, even though it's a small thing, it can be a big thing. And there is important news that we all need that access to. And that's something that I think needs to be equalized again.
Thank you. And the last word belongs to Kenzie.
I'd have to say that I agree with what you both said. So just keeping up with the ADA law and the policies, as well as making sure organizations, agencies, employers, just any people, that they're aware of it. So we're discussing it with people, discussing about disability services, rather than just assuming or just following society or just missing the memo. So we have to make sure that we want it and improving our access. That would be so nice to continue that with like visual cues, like Lori said about the captioning, what's going on, like with COVID-19. So with the news and everything that's going on, we need to make sure that we're aware of what's going on and that it's visible to everybody, because some people might not have seen it. Like myself, that's applied to me. How would I be able to provide more accessibility for myself if I needed to be kept up to date on that?
Mm-hmm.
And same with kids, with technology, it's always improving, it's always getting faster. So hopefully in the future, technology will be incorporated into accessibility so that those two can catch up to one another.
Thank you. I can't think of a better way to end than that. So thank you, Kenzie, for wrapping it all up and bringing it together. And thank you to Emmanuel, Lori, and Kenzie for continuing the conversation with us tonight. The Americans with Disabilities Act will celebrate its 30th anniversary next week on July 26th. Iowa PBS's programs that you watch with us tonight, Accessibility Now, will air on statewide Iowa PBS tomorrow, Monday, July 20th at 8 p.m., followed by a special edition of Iowa Press focused on the ADA at 8:30 p.m. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.